Hello, everyone, and welcome to IDEO's Creative Confidence podcast, where we talk to creative leaders and experts about innovation, leadership, and growth. I'm your host, Mina Seetharaman, head of new ventures here at IDEO, and also of the team here at IDEO U. Today, we are going to be talking about something that most leaders I know feel pretty acutely every single day, and it's the concept of constraints. Tight budgets, lean teams, doing more with less. If I hear that phrase one more time, I think I might roll my eyes back in my head. And we're not just going to talk about what to do about it, but actually how it can be a benefit to us. Our guest today has spent years researching the science of how people do their best work. And his new book makes the case that actually, for some of us, might feel a little bit counterintuitive, that the constraints that you're working under might not be the problem, but in fact, they might be the point. I am delighted today to welcome David Epstein to the program. Hi, David.
Hi, thank you for having me. And I don't know if you know Mina, but I've been to the IDEO headquarters before and had a wonderful time. So I'm a longtime fan.
Well, you should come back and visit because we would
Would love
always
to.
be happy to host you in any of our studios.
Thank you.
I have to say that I have very much been looking forward to this conversation. The team probably is tired of hearing me talk about it, frankly. You are one of my favorite thinkers and one of my favorite authors. Many of you will know David from his New York Times bestsellers, The Sports Gene, and also Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. My staging copy is behind me. I have 3 copies of the book Range. And it really, that book in particular, I think, changed how a lot of us think about our own careers, myself included, how we build teams, and why the winding path is often exactly the right path. David actually joined us on the podcast a few years ago to talk about range, and it was a really fantastic and inspiring conversation. He is back today to talk about his new book, Inside the Box: How Constraints Make Us Better. I'm a little embarrassed for you to see my working copy with all of the stick notes in it. And the short version is this: we live in a world that tells us more is always better, more options, more resources, more freedom. But David spent years looking at the science, and what he found is that oftentimes the opposite can be true. Constraints don't just force creativity, they often help us generate it. So, today we're going to talk about what constraints can mean for us, how we lead, how we design work, how we help our teams do their best thinking. And that can be true whether you're navigating real resource constraints or whether you're looking for a smarter way to set up creative work from the very beginning. So, David, welcome back. It is great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So, when you were last on Creative Confidence, as I mentioned, you were talking about range. You were talking about generalists, why they thrive, why breadth matters, that winding path. And so, for a lot of our listeners, including myself, we've carried those lessons with us. This time, you're here to talk a little bit more about constraints and limits. And for some of us, those ideas might seem a little bit at odds with each other.
Mhm.
And so I'd love to know from your vantage point, what's the through line? How did you get from range to being set down this particular path?
Yeah, in some ways, it was responsive to the most common reader question I got, which was something along the lines of, okay, I'm really broadly curious. I'm interested in all these different things, but I have trouble figuring out what to actually do with that. And I put myself completely in that boat. I had a zigzaggy career. I'm interested in tons of things. There's a lot of things I want to, coming up with ideas is never my problem. It's deciding which ones to execute on and how. So there was a lot of me search in it, writing the book that I needed that was also responsive to the kind of questions I was hearing from other people that I think are like me. So it was very much about once you have this broad toolbox, right, that you need to adapt in a changing world, but at some point you have to focus that into achievement. And so it was about how we do that. There's this famous work in organizational behavior literature that's about what's called the explore exploit trade-off. And explore is exploring new ideas, new solutions. And exploit is taking what you've learned and drilling in and extracting as much value as you can from that. That started in organizational behavior and then moved to individuals. And in both cases, it looks like the pattern for long-term success is kind of toggling between explore and exploit. You try different things, you gain new knowledge, and that shows you somewhere you should drill down. And then you extract a lot of value, and then you zoom back out and explore. And so I sort of viewed these books as my explore exploit duo, even though that language is a little bit ugly.
I think it's a really nice way of pairing the two, though, because that idea that, your broad experience gives you this amazing toolkit, but the constraints force you to creatively reach into that toolkit and use the right things, I think is a really nice pairing of the two. But I do want to think a little bit about the definition of constraint because I
Mhm,
think we all have like a sort of simplistic definition of it, right? Like,
mhm,
like a
mhm.
constraint's a limit, it's an obstacle, it's a thing we work around. But I think you have a slightly more, I don't know if the word is robust, but I'll use that phrase, like a slightly more robust definition of constraint. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that just because I think it helps frame up the notion of constraint and how you talk about it in the book for us.
I mean, broadly speaking, the way that I think of constraints is as some limitation or boundary that blocks what you would do with complete
Mhm.
freedom, or and often what it's doing is blocking the most convenient solution that you could
Right.
reach for. Because as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham says, you may think your brain is made for thinking, but it's actually made for preventing you from having to think whenever possible because thinking is energetically costly. And so if you have just an open field of possibility, you will reach for the most convenient path or the most convenient solution. And again, very broadly speaking, constraints are something that block that most convenient path and force you to go somewhere else.
You talk about a couple of useful things that constraints help us do. One of them is prioritize,
Yeah.
right? Like ruthlessly, which is hard, but I think the constraint helps you do that. What's the other item that helps us to do?
I think that is one of the pillars. Yeah. Forcing you to clarify priorities and launching you into productive exploration.
Mm.
Because when that convenient path is taken away, you're forced to start trying to find new ways to go about things. And that forced exploration can often be incredibly fruitful, even when it's difficult, right? I mean, the word constraint is practically synonymous with something that is frustrating or that we typically don't want. So I'm trying a little bit of a rebrand or an emotional reframe on limitations here. And so I think it's clarify priorities and force new exploration.
There's something kind of interesting about it too, because I think the flip side of this is we often talk about this idea of like carte blanche or like a blank canvas, right? Like we sort of have the picture in our heads that if you give the most creative people a blank sheet of paper, that's when their creativity runs away unfettered and they'll come away with just the most amazing ideas.
Yeah.
But I think we've all seen it to some degree that like no constraints and open brief, it often doesn't lead there. Like my kids use the parlance, like that's where you get a really mid idea, right? Like it's just sort of average. They either freeze or they come up with an idea that kind of could have come from anywhere. Can you talk about what happens in those moments? Like why do we end up in those places?
Yeah. And this shows up in a mountain of research where if people are given too much freedom, they basically do things, mid that they've seen before or that are just easy. And again, it's because of how our brains are made to take the convenient path. Your brain, to use an analogy, is like a browser that you put cookies on all the time. And so as it wants to go certain places, right, that are easy, but that's not often where creativity and breakthrough lives. And so if you really just have open possibilities, you'll go down what cognitive scientists call the path of least resistance. You'll just do something really familiar, something you've seen before. And so it's only really when that is taken away that you're suddenly forced to think in all these new ways. There's actually one psychologist has termed this the green eggs and ham effect. And she named it for the fact that Dr. Seuss wrote Green Eggs and Ham on a bet with a publisher that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. And that forced him, because he couldn't experiment with vocabulary, to develop this rollicking rhythm that became famous. And she named it that because you see in study after study after study, when you hem people in, there is such a thing as too much constraint. So let's say in research where people will be asked to make something mechanical or something like that, and they can pick from 100 different pieces and make whatever they want. Their creations are much less creative than if someone tells them you can use 20 pieces from the 100 and you have to make a piece of furniture. Then they're much more creative. But if you say you can only use these 20 pieces and you have to make a chair, then creativity drops again. So if you're really giving both the what and the how, that can end up being, if the person says, could I still surprise myself? And the answer is no, that could be too much constraint. But it takes a lot to get there. For the most part, when you start hemming people in, they become more creative. And back to that Dr. Seuss point, the reason he even had that bet, I read a lot of children's literature from pre-Dr. Seuss, and it was like dead boring. It was so literal. Johnny ties his shoe, walks to school. And he was asked to write a book using about 200 words from a vocabulary list. He looks at the list and sees there are almost no adjectives and starts complaining to his wife. He makes this I think fine Seussian comment. He says it's like trying to make a strudel without any strudels. And he just throws up his hands and says, "You know what? I'm just going to take the first two rhyming words on the list and write a book." And the first two rhyming words on the list were cat and hat. And that's what forced him to say that, okay, rhythm is going to be my tool here because vocabulary can't be. And that's how he developed this incredibly unique rhythm. From then on, he started hemming himself in purposely and started a whole book imprint that changed children's literature, where he would force vocabulary lists. Every image had to run continuously across 2 pages. The image wasn't allowed to depict anything that wasn't described on the page, only certain color palettes. And sometimes other authors complained about it, and he said, well, okay, then our imprint's not for you. And
Right.
it totally changed children's literature. Even the authors that he had, that it's called beginner books, that would complain, ended up doing their best work.
That's so interesting. It's almost like what started out as a limitation that was frustrating, he added more, right? It's almost like, how much smaller can I make the box? Because the box
Yep.
became kind of fun to him.
Absolutely. And then he helped bring people through what had happened to him, where he was frustrated and then saw that it led to his best work. And then he would get the same thing with authors coming to beginner books saying, this is ridiculous. This is impossible. Why would I do this? How could I possibly do better with less choice? And so he would kind of walk them through the same transformation he had gone through. And so it brought out the best in a lot of people.
I feel like that Dr. Seuss example is a really great example of how constraints can really help you to be more creative and have fun with it. At the start of the book, though, you talk about this company that most of us have never heard of, except probably if we've read your book, called General Magic. I feel like they're a really good example of a company that maybe could have done with some constraints. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of General Magic? Yeah.
So I like to call General Magic the most important company that nobody's ever heard of. And not important because of what they did, but really because of the people, the lessons that came out of it for the people that were there. So General Magic was the first ever, in the mid-90s, so-called concept IPO in Silicon Valley history. Goldman Sachs took them public with just an idea because their vision was so incredible. So this was a company founded in 1990 by 3 former Apple employees. 2 of them had created the original Mac, and one of them, this guy named Mark Peratt, who would become the CEO, his job inside of Apple was looking to the future after personal computing. And he was an absolute visionary. In researching the book, I read his PhD dissertation done at Stanford in 1976. And it is an eerie thing to read because he sees the future, like the next 40 years of technological transformation. On the first page of his dissertation, he coins the term information economy. He sees not just the promise of technology that's coming, but problems with misinformation, with rising inequality, etc. And in 1989, before the web exists, 15% of American households have computers at this point. He sketches a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons, only a touchscreen, and rectangular apps that you'll be able to get. It is the iPhone in 1989, right? At that time, mobile phones were like the size of a thermos.
Yeah, they're huge. I
And
had one. They were like a brick, basically,
that's right.
to walk around with.
And he said, this is going to be a phone, and it's going to be a computer, and it's going to be a TV, and it's going to be an ATM, and all these things. And so the vision was so alluring that international companies, piled in. They put in millions of dollars and all became partners to make this personal communicator. The consortium, what they called the alliance, it was all the companies you've heard of, Sony, AT&T, Apple, etc. The alliance covered so much of the communications technology world that their meetings had to start with an antitrust lawyer listing all the things they were not allowed to discuss. And talent and money just poured in, and they could do anything. Peratt later said his goal in raising so much money so quickly, stock price doubled on the first day of IPO. His goal was to create heaven for engineers, where they were just free to create and limited only by their imagination. What more could anyone ask for, he said. And I think the answer turned out to be a little less freedom because they could do anything because of their talent and resources. And so they frequently did do anything. Every good idea someone had got added on. And the project expanded and expanded. This huge alliance added huge amounts of complexity. When more money came in, they just grew, right? They lost sight of this Brooks's law, which is when you add more people to a project that's already late, it will become even more late because you underestimate how complexity explodes when you add people and resources. And they had an ill-defined customer. They called their customer Joe Sixpack, and nobody bothered to define who that was, so they weren't really solving a problem for anyone obvious. And when this personal communicator finally appeared, years late, because they kept adding and adding, adding, it was incoherent. Like nobody understood what they were supposed to do with it. It was super expensive because they added so much stuff. It didn't have a phone, which was initially the core priority because it had so much other stuff. I think an emblematic interview about what went wrong at General Magic was with this engineer named Steve Perlman, whose job was to create a calendar function. And he wrote it to go from 1904 to 2096 and then checked it in. And a team leader came to him and said, Steve, someone might write historical apps that go back farther. You got to make this thing go back farther. So he opens it up and writes it to go from year one to the future, checks it in, thinks he's done. Then another team comes to him and says, Steve, why are you tying it into this arbitrary religious context? You should start at the beginning of astronomical time. So he opens it up again and writes it to go from the Big Bang to the future, right? So it ends up taking months. When if they had stuck with 1904 to 2096, it would have been 4 lines of code. And this is how everything was at General Magic. Because they could do anything, they did. And I interviewed, dozens of former employees there. And I'd say 3/4 of them said some version of, I just couldn't figure out what not to do. And
Right.
so they really had no focus. They took in some incredible lessons out of there, but the company itself became an epic disaster.
Yeah, reading that story was amazing. I mean, I was sharing with you how it felt like I was watching a movie. Like I kind of wished I'd had popcorn as I was flipping through the pages. What I
Appreciate that.
didn't tell you was I used to be a project manager many, many moons ago. And the whole time that I was reading that story, I thought, oh my gosh, why is nobody doing a code freeze? Why is nobody doing a feature freeze? Like, just stop and ship already. I once had an Italian client ask me to build a website for 9,600 baud. And all I kept thinking of the time period that they were doing this is who's going to even be able to use this because nobody, like the internet didn't really exist yet at scale. And so it wasn't surprising to me when I got to the end that they couldn't actually, like the whole thing was defunct. But it was amazing to me to watch that story unfold because it was so prescient and yet couldn't actually ship in the end because they couldn't decide what not to do as
Yeah.
part of their strategy. It was fascinating to me.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned Italy. You just reminded me of the Wall Street Journal had this article a little while ago about how the US went from being the world's leading shipbuilders to complete laggards. And it was very much about a lack of design freeze. Like
Mm.
everyone keeps adding features and they can never stop and say, this is it. We're done. And then we can prototype and test if we want, but it just keeps growing and growing. On the bright side, though, it was such a scarring experience for some of the young people there that they took these lessons about the importance of boundaries and went out and built technology that every person listening to this probably touches every day. LinkedIn, eBay, Android, iPod, iPhone, Google Maps, Safari, Apple Watch, etc. And they were suffused with these lessons about the importance of boundaries. No one more so than Tony Fadell, who became an important figure in the book and led the design of the iPod and set these really tight deadlines, what he called heartbeats. And then it'd say, now we freeze, gather our lessons, and go to the next one. But when I was talking to him about Nest, so he also co-founded the smart thermostat company Nest. And he was such a zealot for constraints. When I first interviewed him, he was almost yelling at me. He's like, if you don't have constraints, make up constraints. He's a very enthusiastic guy.
Mhm.
And he forced the team to work inside a literal box at Nest where he said, we're going to prototype the packaging before the product because this is what the end user is going to see. And if it doesn't fit on this box, then it's clearly not a priority. He said the best advice he gives to entrepreneurs he mentors today is to write the press release before they start the project because that will force you to define who do I think I'm doing this for? What is the problem I think I'm solving? I actually took that advice and did it for my book. He was one of my first interviews. So they took important lessons from it, but the company itself was disastrous.
Yeah, some amazing people actually came out of that as I was reading the book. It was kind of fascinating. But you raise a really interesting point, this idea of leaders setting constraints. And so I kind of want to dig in there a little bit because a lot of the folks who listen to the podcast, they do lead teams, they run design sprints, they facilitate creative work.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of us who lead teams think that our job is mostly to remove obstacles for our teams and to try and get them um, it's sort of the General Magic story, like how much resource can I get my team? But sometimes that might be the wrong approach. So what does it look like as a leader to design constraints on purpose
Yeah.
for your team?
I mean, I think it depends on situations, obviously, a
Sure.
lot, but let me use a few examples. So I contrast General Magic in the book to Pixar, in part because they had also basically a 20-year vision at the exact same time. So they were projecting out to making the world's first fully computer animated feature film, which was Toy Story. They were developing in parallel, basically. And I spent a lot of time with Ed Catmull, the co-founder of Pixar. And for 20 years, his job was essentially titrating constraints, right? I thought of Pixar as this place of unfettered imagination, but it turns out to be a place of very many fetters that help channel ideas into achievement. Or I thought of it sort of like the bumpers that you put in the gutters of a bowling alley. Ed would say things like they would keep directors in small teams for years, simplifying the core of a story. And that might seem really inefficient, but the costs only explode once people move into production. And so that actually turned out to be very efficient if you could keep people small, even if they wanted to get into production. They would have rules like the 3 pitches rule, where you'd force directors to pitch 3 ideas because if they only pitch one, they get stuck to it. There's something called the creative cliff illusion, where we think our best creative ideas come first, but they actually come later. And I use that in writing, by the way, where in writing the book, I would write the opening of a chapter, then cross it out and force myself to write 2 other openings. So that's basically just a form of blocking the convenient path. 9 of the 12 chapters use either the second or third opening because you have to just get started. The first thing that comes to mind, but it's not necessarily the best. And sometimes what he would do was help make constraints visible so that people could prioritize. Like he told me about this thing they had called the beautifully shaded penny problem, where directors would get obsessed with some tiny detail in the background of a shot, like the shading on a penny, and have animators working away on it while more important priorities were getting lost. And so they came up with this system where they Velcroed popsicle sticks onto a board. Each popsicle stick represented the amount of work that one animator could do in 1 week. And if the director wanted to keep animating that penny, they had to start moving sticks away from some other character that had to be animated and making the trade-off visible immediately solve the problem. So I think part of what leadership uh, can do is help people stay smaller longer. So before they move into execution, they're working out the boundaries, help them make the trade-offs visible so that they're always being forced to prioritize. I think helping people feel a sense of agency in useful boundaries, because otherwise it can feel like punishment. So I actually saw one CEO I was shadowing was running a company that had done very well for a long time and now was coming under pressure, or a long time or medium time. And he convened his group and called this exercise legacy constraint, where he said, pretend we're going out of business in 2 years and only we know it and our customers don't. They weren't going out of business in 2 years, but if they didn't turn it around, maybe 5 years. And immediately people started saying, well, I would stop focusing on X and I'd put more emphasis on Y because that's where the real value is. And he said, well, all right, maybe we should be doing that then. And I think not only was this a smart way because some things had to get changed to get ideas for that, but to make people feel like they were part of it, that it wasn't just these constraints or forced reprioritization that was coming from on high. And I think there are a lot of thought experiments like that that leaders can do that can help get the best out of people, whether that's saying, hey, if we weren't allowed to propose the usual thing in this next client meeting, what would we propose instead? All the way to cultural exercises like if you're a leader and you say, well, if I could only have more of one behavior, if I had to pick one behavior that I wanted more of, what would it be? And that's not realistic, but it can help you clarify what is it that I think we need more of in my culture. And so I think it's coming up with thoughtful constraints that help people prioritize and experiment in productive ways.
AI is everywhere. It's exciting, but let's be honest, it can feel overwhelming too. How do you actually use it to solve problems, not just add more complexity? IDEOU's AI and Design Thinking Certificate is designed to help leaders like you make sense of AI, giving you practical, hands-on tools to enhance decision-making, streamline innovation, and lead with confidence. No hype, just real skills. Check it out at ideo.in/AI cert. That's ideo.in/AICERT. Now, back to the show. That sort of leads me to a question that I've been contemplating. You touched on it a little bit earlier, which is this notion of good constraints versus a bridge too far.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for leaders to set constraints for all of the reasons we've been talking about, blocking the path of least resistance to sort of force us to reach into our toolkit and be a little bit more creative to see where else we can go. How do you know when you've actually gone too far or you've sort of shut down creativity and sort of like blocked all the exits out of the box, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of art to this, right? Because if
Mhm,
your people end up saying, I can no longer surprise myself, then
mhm,
you've gone too far. And there's some things we know specifically from research, like with deadlines. Deadlines can be either quite good for creativity or quite bad for creativity. The good side is like Duke Ellington, who famously said, I don't need time. What I need is a deadline, because he could
mhm.
be sort of maniacally focused when he had a deadline. But the research shows that if a deadline leads an individual or a team to start multitasking like crazy to try to make it, that destroys
Right.
creativity. If it leads them to start monotasking and like really focus in, then it boosts creativity. And that, I think, probably has something to do with how the leader is kind of protecting them under that deadline, right? Saying like, okay, they have this deadline, and so now it's really time to focus on this. So it can go either way. There's a lot of nuance there. But a lot of times I think it has to do with if you're telling people the how, not just the what. I ended up interviewing a lot of people who worked with Steve Jobs, not because I was intending to write about him, but because I wrote about Pixar and General Magic. I just ended up interviewing a lot of people who used to work with him. And one of the things that became clear to me was that in his early years, he had more micromanaging tendencies. And when he went to Next Computers and he said, the hard drive case has to be a perfect magnesium cube. And the engineers are like, you're not leaving us with any room to problem solve. And then when he came back from those years in the wilderness in the late 90s to Apple, from the people I talked to, they said he was much more of a boundary setter at that point, where he would just spend a ton of time figuring out what are the boundaries and then trusting the people to solve within that. So he famously, when he came back and Apple was in danger of going out of business and was making like printers and servers and this thing called the Newton and a million different computer models, and he drew a 2x2 grid on a whiteboard, and it said consumer and pro on one axis and portable and desktop on the other axis. He said, we're only doing 4 things now, and here's what they're going to be. And at first, a lot of projects got shuttered because of that. But complexity really steals clarity. So I think if you can give that kind of clarity, it actually empowers people to problem solve, right? Like the advertising industry has a famous saying, give me the freedom of a tight brief.
Mhm.
So I think if the constraints are more definitional as opposed to this is how you have to do the thing, those are usually bad constraints. And that can come in where if someone has no resources, then how you have to do the thing is so hemmed in that there may not be that much chance for creativity.
As I was reading the book too, I was thinking about like choosing the right constraint. I come from an advertising and a media background, and I used to have clients who would say to our teams, just add more people. And there are times when adding more people works, like when the tasks are individual, but there are
Right.
times when that doesn't work at all. And I used to pull out the phrase, well, 9 women don't make a baby in a month. Like we're at that point in the project. And I would really push hard on clients because I said, like, adding to your earlier point, adding more people at this point is actually just going to slow us down because that's not the equation we're trying to solve for right now.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, removing scope would be the only thing that would make us go faster now.
Yeah, but Brooks's law. I mean, you're defining Brooks's
Mhm.
law, and he used that same example. He would say it doesn't matter how many women you assign, the baby's still going to take 9 months. We always underestimate how complexity explodes when we add more stuff. As Brooks pointed out, he was a legendary computer scientist. Only if a task doesn't require communication and is completely separable do you have a
Right.
linear increase between the number of people you add and the amount you get done. Otherwise, we really underestimate things like how long it takes to assimilate someone to the team. So that's why if you add more people to a project that's late, it gets even later. The trouble is that humans have a pair of biases, one called additive bias and its cousin, subtraction neglect bias. An additive bias is we always reach for addition to solve problems. Subtraction neglect bias is we overlook subtractive solutions. The theory is that having too much of stuff was not a problem in human history, but having too little was. And so we're just not attuned to the idea of having too much choice or too many resources or anything like that. And there are really interesting studies showing this. Like one of my favorites is sort of funny, where people are asked to bolster a Lego structure so it would hold a masonry brick over the head of a Star Wars stormtrooper, and they could add as many pieces as they wanted, but they had to pay for out of their reward to add pieces. And yet almost everyone added multiple pieces when just taking away one obvious piece would have solved the problem instantly. So we're just not wired for that. And so I think it's pretty important to do regular subtraction audits. So based on a genetics lab that I was reporting about in Inside the Box, I borrowed something they did where they made all of their current commitments visible, Post-its on a wall, and immediately saw there was twice as much stuff going on as they could get done, even in a best case scenario. And they made a funnel and said, okay, here are the highest priorities. So these other things are on the back burner. And now they implemented the stop starting, start finishing rule, where you're not allowed to put something else in the top of the funnel unless something else comes out the bottom of the funnel. And they ended up getting like twice as many things actually done, and their work became less chaotic. So I do that for myself every once in a while. I'll put all my current commitments, make them visible on the wall, and instantly I'll see there are some high priorities here and some medium priorities. And, I would love to be able to get all of these things done. And I have a tendency to say, well, what productivity tool do I need to get it done? But those are often illusory, right? Those are often, as Oliver Burkeman would say, basically trying to get us out of recognizing our mortality and realizing that we have limited time and energy and need to actually prioritize what we're doing here. So I do that quarterly now, where I'll make all the commitments visible, and I'll say, I have to cut out at least one thing in the next 90 days. What's it going to be? And I can see what happens is I build up and up and up, and then I can subtract back down. And so the only way I've figured out of dealing with this bias now is to do it regularly, because otherwise I just keep building on more tools, more dashboards, more meetings, more project starts. I think it's never been easier to do too much than it is now.
Fair.
For the last year, I spent a bunch of time with one AI company that helps other companies implement AI. And to simplify what I observed in that time, some of the companies would rush to implement AI everywhere, and it would kind of sprawl, and they would lead to a lot of what researchers are now calling work slop, just like a huge volume of stuff that's not totally clear if it's connected to strategy, because it removed the hard work of figuring out what you shouldn't be doing.
Right.
Whereas the companies that I think did it had a better implementation would really define the problems they were trying to solve and then say, does the tool fit that problem? Or one company made what they called a map of the jobs to be done. It was like literally a map of all the things that they were doing. And so they spent a lot of time defining the problem before just rushing into implementation everywhere.
So this actually takes me to a topic I wanted to cover that's related to prototyping, actually. So when I was reading the whole conversation in the book around Pixar planning, it harkened me the notion of lo-fi prototyping, which is a very large part of the process at IDEO when we do our work. It's one of our fundamental practices. We like to do low fidelity prototyping early in the process. It's fast, it's cheap, it lets you test ideas before it's expensive. It becomes expensive to throw them away, for example. And so for us, that's all about constraint, right? It limits the time, it limits the materials, it limits the fidelity. And so that feels like it falls into the productive constraint category for us and has always served us well. In the AI world, prototyping becomes easier, especially at higher fidelity. It's something that my colleagues and I talk about a lot. And you'd recently posted on LinkedIn about how AI removes a lot of friction, for example, and it also removes the time in which we would ask ourselves, like, should I? Should I be building this? Should I be doing this? And I wondered what your thoughts were on this perspective, on if the low fidelity aspect of things, the testing things, experimenting, while it's still cheaper, while you can throw things away and start again. If that's of value, do we lose something, or in the AI world where some of that becomes so much easier to do? Or is there some value in that as well? It's sort of what we grapple with a little bit in the prototype aspect of things.
I think it's a both. When I visited IDEO, I was shown a video of a really fun prototype. This was like early iPhone days, of an app for kids where they could control a monster and sort of customize their monster. And the way that this was the initial prototype, rather than being an app, was a large like poster board cut out with a sticker of an iPhone on it, and a human being standing behind the screen imitating what the app would do, and another human being pretending to swipe and explain to her colleagues what was going on here, right? But they were prototyping the important part, which was the customer interface, right? The user experience.
Yeah.
And, like Claude Code could whip that up in 2 seconds now, or some prototype of it. But I actually think that was still probably a useful thing to do because it slows your thinking down some, right? And in the book, I talk about the work of Bent Flubier, who spent his whole life studying projects and found that the successful pattern is think slow, act fast, where you do things that intentionally slow you down early on, so that you can do your thinking. We're now seeing this sort of first generation of research about how AI affects cognition coming out, and some of it's a little bit scary. If I had to summarize, it's still early days, but there is some research piling up that it looks like it's GPS for your brain, or it can be. Where if you're using GPS all the time, you don't learn how to get around. And that's okay if you always have GPS available But if you are actually have to do some of the thinking and learn how to do some of the thinking, that's not so good. If I had to summarize the takeaway from that research, it's brain first, tool second. Like really make sure you're doing your thinking first. MIT has done these studies where with students writing essays at different times and not to belabor all the details, but basically the students who had access to ChatGPT early don't learn anything. And the ones who were not given it first and had to write on their own first, and then they were given ChatGPT later, they learn a lot. And so I think forcing ourselves to do these more basic, really rudimentary exercises early on still has a lot of value. And then you can turn to the tool and use it. But I think it can make things a little too easy. And you skip over what psychologists call desirable difficulties. Like the reason that Tony Fadell had the team prototyping that box is because it forces you to do this really hard thinking. I'll tell you myself, I've made little prototypes of apps and things like that with Claude Code, and it's fun and
Sure.
it's interesting and it's really cool to have something. I think the danger is that we skip over that thinking slow about what's the most important thing here? What should I be doing? What problem am I solving?
Yeah, I think we would agree with you. We think it's an excellent tool to help us interrogate further an idea, but it shouldn't sort of stop you at the most simplistic part of the process. The first question that I'd like to, well, the 17th question that I would like to ask you is about designing for constraints. I was really excited to see this in the book. We have an inclusive design collective at Audio, and there's a whole chapter in here about designing specifically for constraints. You have a great story in there about designing for, it's a military story about body armor and the challenges around that. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's such a good story about how the constraint really represents an opportunity in the end.
Yeah. So I was talking about again, yeah, the design of body armor, which in the US since Vietnam had gotten bulkier and bulkier and
Hmm.
bulkier. And every time soldiers were injured in new ways, it just added more and more and more armor until the point when the armor and the other accoutrements were weighing as much as some of the soldiers, or in some cases more. This was leading to all sorts of bad things, like immobility, that was costing lives in some
Yeah.
cases. But as one of the designers told me, it was the Christmas tree effect. It was just you put more ornaments on the tree and you never take anything away. And when the Army had this sort of reckoning, they have this obstacle course that they use for testing new armor. And I've done this obstacle course as part of reporting. And the first thing you do is drop through a simulated hatch on the top of a Jeep. And they had added so much body armor that one day, one of the testing soldiers got stuck on the first part of the obstacle course, lodged in the hatch. But when they were really forced to face this problem was when about 10 years ago, women were first allowed into the close combat force in the military, and the body armor outweighed a lot of them. And so what they did to try to accommodate this was they took measurements of women and started redesigning some of the armor to be leaner, to take some of the things away that weren't that important, and make different sort of sizes that you could mix and match. And in doing that, and women were about 2% of the close combat force. But in making this sleeker armor that allowed for more mobility, they did things like they removed a shoulder notch. And it turned out that everybody hated that shoulder notch, and they were just going like this to try to shoulder a rifle anyway. Or they made a notch in the back of a neck protector so that women could have a hair bun would fit into the notch. Turned out everybody liked to be able to lift their head up when they were lying on the ground. So all these things that were made for women, it turned out that a huge portion of the men were also best served by these. And so eventually the Army started calling them unisex instead of for women, just to encourage the guys to use them. So many of the issues with mobility that women were having with this heavy equipment turned out to be just somewhat more extreme versions of problems that most of the men were having too. And so the design principle I was writing about there is one that came out of what's known as universal design, is where when you focused on users with the most extreme constraints, whether they're big or they're small or they're old or they're young or they have a disability, you're often dealing with problems that other people have too, just not in as extreme a form.
Right.
And so it can be a really useful way to target user problems and design for user problems, whether it's a product, a process, or public spaces is a very famous one.
Right. I thought it was such a really good example of, rather than looking at it through the lens of a quote unquote fringe audience, looking at it through a benefit that could be so applicable more broadly. And the return on that investment could actually really pay off.
Yeah. So once I started reporting on this, like one person would pass me to the next person for examples. And I ended up talking to the chief technology officer from the VA, the healthcare system that serves, I mean, it is socialized medicine in the US. It has to serve every veteran, no matter their circumstances. And he said, a lot of the best websites came out of creating for mobile, came out of creating sites They could use screen readers for
Oh,
people who had
yes.
visual impairment because you had to set them up logically and make these logical menus, and that turned out to be the best for mobile. And so it's just like one example after another of things that started as intentioned for accessibility ended up just becoming desirable because they focused people on what was a absolute limiting factor for some users, but was an annoyance for lots of other users, even if they could get
Mm,
over it.
absolutely. So you have a great set of constraint exercises for teams as a companion to the book, and they can find them on your website, davidepstein.com. But
Mhm.
could you walk us through one of your favorites that you find that you recommend to people? I just think these are such good exercises.
Well, yeah, I'm going to tell you one that's not on there because you can go see the
Okay,
ones that are
great.
on there
Yeah, yeah.
because stuff about blocking your work and attention focus is all on there. So this one's a little different. There's something I come to call the Hemingway Principle, which is Ernest Hemingway used to end his workday in the middle of a sentence because that told him the following morning where he was going to start with
Mm,
his most important work. And I've found, and I've seen in research by people like Gloria Mark and others, if people haven't made something that's important the priority for where they're going to start the next day, they will typically start with things that are passive, scrolling, inbox checking, stuff like that. And those things may not be that important. They're just easy.
right.
And so my last act of every workday is to say, what is the thing that I will start with tomorrow morning before I turn on my phone? I turn off my phone at the end of days. And I don't turn it on again until I've done that first thing, and I don't get in my inbox before that. And I find that to be incredibly useful. There's also something in psychology called the mere urgency effect, which is people will do things that they can get done quickly because they feel urgent, like responding to an email, even if they're much more important things for them actually to be focusing on. And so I view that as a sort of constraint on my behavior where the phone isn't getting turned on until I start with that thing I designated the day before. And I find that to be really helpful for my productivity.
I'm going to give that a try. I wrote it down. Hemingway Principle. That's excellent. Thank you. All right, we're going to take a couple of audience questions. So, Rachel asks us, can artificial constraints be as useful as real ones when looking for creative solutions?
Absolutely. All that green eggs and ham effect stuff is artificial, right? Dr. Seuss, or this crowd may especially would know Simone Yetch, the crazy inventor online. She got known, excuse my language, as the queen of shitty robots for making these kind of Rube Goldberg machines. But she also makes ingenious products too. When I was interviewing her, she told me that she really can't create if she just has an open field of possibilities. So she created these set of dice, these 3 dice that it'll be like object, material and use or something like that. And she'll roll the dice and that'll give her a starting place. Like she has to make a chair out of cardboard that plays music or something. And she can change once she's going, but it gives her a place to start. That's totally artificial. So I think artificial constraints can be really useful. And you'll see the on the site, some of these things are just thought exercises, right? To say, oh, well, if you had half the time and half the budget, what would you do? And that doesn't mean you actually have it. It's just thinking that way. The reason I did that one is because one of the early readers of the book was a guy named Ed Hoffman, who was the first chief knowledge officer at NASA. So he's in charge of institutional learning. And he said, I have to tell you about this mission called L-Cross, where the engineers ended up with half the time and budget that they
Hmm.
wanted. So what did they do? Well, first they complained. And then one of the team leaders said, if we were going to get this done anyway, how would we do it? And they couldn't build from scratch, so it forced them to borrow. They took imaging equipment straight from army tanks and engine temperature sensors straight from NASCAR and built the probe that confirmed water on the moon. And that became part of their practice to say, well, what would we do if we had half the time and half the budget, even when they didn't actually have that? And so I think even these artificial thought experiments can force you to say, well, what could we do differently if we had to, even if you're not in that position of having to do it? Amazon, famously, by the way, is funny. I was with them recently, and you think of that as the place that has everything. And yet people in there are constantly complaining about how they don't have enough resources. Like, you're Amazon, you have everything. But frugality is such a big part of their identity that they really squeeze their teams a lot to force them to. So they're obsessive about frugality. So it's really funny to be in a place like that and everyone's complaining about how they don't have any resources.
Yeah, it's very much a part of the ethos there. Anya has a question for us. Any tips or advice for getting buy in on constraints? Oftentimes, when attempting to put constraints in place, we encounter strong resistance and would love to hear your perspective on how to navigate this.
Yeah, I think 2 things. One is that constraints are often, for obvious reasons, framed or received as only what we're not doing.
Mm.
I think it can be very useful to flip that framing and say, what are the really important values and projects for us that we're going to make sure we are doing? And we need to get rid of this other stuff in order to make sure that we're really focused on our values. And so trying to turn it around to say, this liberates us, this constraint either liberates us to explore creatively, or, this restriction that's being put on us means we obviously have to find a new way. And that's we're being told to do that. Or we have to cut away because some certain value or project is so important to us that we want to make sure that it's in focus. So that's one thing. The other, I think, is using these kinds of thought experiments like that legacy constraint that I described earlier to make the people who are going to be affected part of the process. Because otherwise they can receive it as a punishment,
Right.
right? If it's just a dictate from on high. So how can they be involved in the process? And you can use them for kind of harvesting ideas, if you will, and giving people some ownership. Because otherwise, especially if it's an issue of resources, right? People are always going to see it as a negative, even if it's good for them. So can you get people to be in on some of that sort of problem solving? And you'll see these in some of the exercises, like identifying bottlenecks that are delaying work, or implementing the stop, starting, start, finishing tool. And when that was implemented in a case study that I write about in the book, it's framed as this is actually going to help us get the things that we most want to get done. So I think that's part of the leadership, is including people in devising those and framing it as something that will liberate us to do interesting things and keep our values front and center.
Yeah, you've also talked about how that can help it just not feel arbitrary, because people can tell when it's arbitrary and when it's purposeful. And
Yeah.
the first sort of breeds animosity and frustration, but the second makes people feel like they're part of something bigger. And that's actually kind of important.
I think even arbitrary constraints can sometimes be useful, again, to the Dr. Seuss model
Sure.
but I think it depends kind of how they're delivered also, right? Is it,
Yeah.
we're going to try this because it might get us to new creative territory, right? And I write in the book about Patricia Stokes, this psychologist who studied the history of artistic innovation. And basically the theme that she found was what she called paired constraints in the history of artistic
Right.
innovation. Paired because there are two phases: the preclude constraint, where an innovator blocks the status quo, and the promote constraint, where they say, this is what I'm putting in its place. So a prototypical example from her work is Claude Monet, who said, I'm no longer going to use light and dark shades in painting. I'm not going to use black at all. He banned black so thoroughly that at his funeral, when they put a black shroud over the coffin, one of his friends freaked out and started yelling, no black for Monet, and went and got a floral tablecloth to put over his coffin. And he said instead he would use just pure colors, not mixed with black or white, next to one another to create these mosaics that would give the viewer any impression of light they could experience in nature. And that was the birth of Impressionism. So he precluded the status quo using light and dark shades and promoted in its place only pure colors in close proximity. And that's what she found was the pattern in artistic innovation in history, where many of these things were arbitrarily set by the artistic innovator, who was very consciously saying, I'm blocking the status quo because I think it's going to get me somewhere that I couldn't have imagined in any other way.
Okay. So, David, now's the time for our lightning round. 7 questions. Don't overthink them, which is a little bit rich for me because I am a classic overthinker, but here we go. What book, film, or article would you recommend to our listeners?
I would recommend In Praise of Shadows by Junichiro Tanizaki. Can I describe it? That will take me another few sentences.
Yeah.
Okay. He was, arguably the greatest Japanese novelist of the 20th century. But this book is a nonfiction extended essay meditation on Western aesthetics crashing into Japanese aesthetics. So bright porcelain tiled bathrooms crashing into wooden buildings that were made to accentuate shadows, because Japan had been closed for 200 years, and then it crashed into the rest of the world. And it's just an incredibly interesting, long opinion on aesthetics, and I think would be fascinating to designers.
Oh,
And
wow.
he's an amazing writer, so it's kind of mesmerizing in its rhythm also.
Excellent. Who is a thinker or leader you look up to?
I'm assuming this is supposed to be someone who is living.
Doesn't have to be.
Okay. Daniel Kahneman was one of my intellectual heroes. He's passed away recently, but I got to have lunch with him, and he helped me set the frame for my book Range. And I actually think one of his greatest moments was when one of the chapters in Thinking Fast and Slow on priming research, the work didn't replicate. That field has basically been blown up. And instead of ignoring it, he went on this scientific blog and said, I fell prey to some of the cognitive biases I write about. Here's what we should do to set a better research agenda. And some people criticized him saying, well, you already sold all those books. And first of all, it would have made no difference if he cut that chapter to his book sales. And I just thought that was exactly what you would want from a public intellectual. And I think he helped set a more rigorous research agenda going forward.
Yeah, you mentioned him in the acknowledgments of your books, and I thought that was really lovely.
Wow, you read the acknowledgments.
Yeah, I always do. I always find that super fascinating. But I'm a big Kahneman fan too. I love to hear it. What's a skill that you are currently working on?
Satisficing, which is something that I write about, which is setting decision rules for what is good enough, and then just taking that and moving on instead of obsessing about how to make it perfect. In fact, my newsletter, this won't make anyone want to read it, but is a satisficing exercise for me, where if a book has to be a 9 or a 10 on the effort level, if I get a newsletter post to 6.5, I send it. And it's a little painful, but I think it's a really good exercise for me in realizing that good enough is often actually great to get you some forward momentum.
Oh, that's excellent. That's actually really good advice. It's really good advice for some of the folks in the book, actually.
Yes.
What is a skill that you're proud of?
I'm really good at picking up new physical skills. So I, in the last year, learned how to shuffle dance. And so when I go to a class or a meetup, I single-handedly raise the average age by about 7 years. But I can pick up physical skills. So I'll go in, I have no idea what I'm looking at, and pretty soon I can pick it up quite quickly. And I think that's because I have such a broad physical background that I'm kind of able to adapt to new physical skills.
Wait, wasn't there somebody who reviewed your book, like Daniel Pink or somebody, who talked about how you're also an amazing dancer? Somebody talked about this.
He may have mentioned that. Yeah, I'm a good dancer. And to me, I like to learn a new physical skill every year. And that's something I'm proud of, because not so much that I'm pretty good at it's like juggling one year and all this stuff, but that I'm willing to be a beginner in those things, even though it's kind of scary to me every time.
That's a really great lesson for all of us. What mistake have you learned from?
Where to begin? I think because I'm very broadly curious, I have a tendency to hold out for sort of the perfect topic to write a book on, or to do a big project on. And there never actually is the perfect topic. And so I think I actually, I don't want to say blew a couple years, but had a couple of very professionally unproductive years because I was just holding out and looking for the perfect thing, when in fact that never exists. And you find something you're interested in, pick it and dive in. I think it was Ellen Langer who said, I would want to fact check that, but said, don't make the right decision, make the decision and then make it right. So I think if you find something you're interested in, you don't have to keep figuratively swiping right on every idea for the rest of your life. You can pick something and dive in.
Nice. What's a philosophy you live by?
There's a philosopher I love who I mentioned very briefly in Inside the Box named Bernard Seuss, who argued for the value of games and sports. And he said that the core essence of all games and sports is an attitude, the voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles, or the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And that gives life meaning. And I agree with that. And so when I take on a project, I am loath to do something that I know I can already do. So I want to take on a project where at the beginning, I don't have all the tools it takes to get to the end. And to me, that is a voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles. And I think that's one of the things that can give life meaning. So I'm always looking for that. Now, I've had pressure after some of my books have done well to basically do something derivative after that. But because I really value running into an obstacle that I'm not sure I can overcome, I've resisted that. I don't know if that's been good commercial decisions, but I think it's been good for making me feel like I have a meaningful career.
And what advice would you give to your younger self?
Hmm. I think I think I would probably apprise my younger self of the so-called arrival fallacy, the idea that like when I just finish this project or when I just have this New York Times bestseller or when I just set a school record as I was a track and field athlete in college, that like then uh, everything's going to be great. It's just not true. Like you have to find a process that you like because the arrival is sort of always underwhelming, I think. Um, so I would say not to that getting to the end of the thing is your that's not when you're going to feel great. Actually, let me revise that a little bit because
Okay.
something related to that. When I was younger, I always felt that for important projects, I'd say, all right, I just have to get these things off my plate and then I can turn to the really important work. You know, you just have to clear the decks and then you can focus on the thing you really want to do. The decks are never clear. They will never be clear.
It's so true.
And so it took me a long time to realize that. So I think I would tell my younger self, like, the decks won't be clear. You have to start the stuff that's really important to you now and just not worry about the decks always being a mess.
That's really good advice. David, thank you so much for today. This conversation is definitely going to stay with me, not just because the books have left an indelible mark, but just such a rich conversation. And I have a feeling a lot of folks in the audience will be thinking about what kind of box they can put themselves in around their next project. A reminder that David's new book, Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better, is available now wherever books are sold, minus all the stick notes in my copy. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, definitely subscribe to Creative Confidence wherever you listen so that you don't miss what's coming up next. And if you have a colleague or a friend who would love to listen to something like this, definitely send them the link because we would love to be a source of inspiration for them as well. Thanks to all of you for being here today, and I'll see you all next time on Creative Confidence.